the most charming person in every room he walks into. Funny, confident, always says exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. Everyone likes him. You've probably called him the life of the party more than once. But here's a question you've maybe never let yourself ask. When something genuinely terrible happens to someone else, does he actually feel anything? Or does he just perform the right face, say the right words, and move on within minutes like nothing happened at all? That gap between what someone shows you and what's actually happening underneath is
Let's clear up the biggest misconception first, because it changes everything about how you should actually be looking for this. When most people hear the word psychopath, they picture a criminal, a murderer, someone locked up, someone dangerous, someone obviously broken. But psychologists studying this trait have found something far more unsettling. Most people with high levels of psychopathic traits are never arrested for anything. They're not in prison. They're in your office, your friend group, sometimes your family. Researchers call this successful psychopathy or high-functioning psychopathy. These are people who score high on traits like fearless dominance and low empathy. But instead of ending up in prison, they channel those exact same traits into business, leadership, sales, even entertainment. The traits that make someone dangerous in one context can make them magnetic, persuasive, and successful in another. Same wiring, completely different outcome, depending entirely on how it gets used.
So if it's not about violence, what are we actually looking for? Psychologists typically point to 4 core traits, and understanding each one individually is what makes the pattern click into place. The first is superficial charm. This is the trait everyone underestimates because we're taught that charm is a good sign, evidence someone is warm and likable. But researchers describe psychopathic charm specifically as performed, not felt. It's a tool deployed strategically to build trust quickly rather than an authentic expression of warmth. The unsettling part is that this charm is often more polished, more confident, more immediately likable than genuine warmth. It's not trying to connect with you, it's trying to get something from you, and connection is just the method.
The second trait is the one that does the most damage over time, and it's the hardest to spot early: a genuine lack of empathy. Not just being a little insensitive sometimes, which happens to everyone. We're talking about a consistent inability or unwillingness to actually register someone else's pain as real. Researchers note this isn't always visible in obvious cruelty. It shows up in smaller, more deniable ways. An insensitive joke immediately after someone shares something painful. A flat, appropriate-sounding response to a tragedy that somehow feels rehearsed rather than felt. Genuine indifference to a friend's distress disguised behind exactly the right words. Here's the unsettling detail researchers keep returning to. People with this trait often know precisely what they're supposed to say in an emotional moment. They just don't feel any of it while saying it. The performance and the emotion have become completely separate systems.
The third trait is manipulation, and this is where things start to feel personal, because you've probably experienced this without having language for it. Psychologists describe this specifically as using charm, not to build connection, but to extract something. Information, loyalty, favors, access, while making the other person feel like they chose to give it freely. This is different from ordinary social influence, which almost everyone does sometimes. The key difference researchers point to is direction. Manipulation in this context consistently flows one way. It's not mutual, it's not reciprocal. One person is always the one extracting value, and the relationship exists specifically to serve that function. If you've ever left an interaction with a friend feeling strangely used without being able to explain exactly why, that gut feeling is worth taking seriously.
The fourth trait is a grandiose sense of self-worth, and this one hides particularly well behind confidence, which our culture tends to reward and admire. There's a specific difference between healthy self-esteem and this trait that's worth understanding clearly. Healthy self-esteem coexists with genuine respect for other people. Grandiosity, in the psychological sense, treats other people as instruments, useful in proportion to what they can provide and largely irrelevant otherwise. Someone with this trait doesn't just think highly of themselves, they quietly believe the normal rules and normal consideration for others simply don't apply to them the way they apply to everyone else.
Now, here's where this gets genuinely important, because these 4 traits rarely show up as isolated incidents. They show up as a pattern, and the pattern is what actually matters. One insensitive joke means nothing. Everyone said something clumsy in an emotional moment. One ambitious, confident friend isn't a red flag. Confidence is completely normal and often healthy. The distinction researchers emphasize again and again isn't any single behavior in isolation. It's whether charm, low empathy, manipulation, and grandiosity are consistently working together, forming a stable, repeating pattern across time and across different relationships, not just showing up once under stress.
There's a genuinely surprising finding that reframes this entire conversation, and it comes from a large community survey of thousands of ordinary people, not prisoners, not patients, just regular members of the public. Researchers found that psychopathic traits, particularly the fearless, dominant kind, were meaningfully associated with holding leadership and management positions, and with successful performance in high-risk, high-stakes occupations. In plain terms, certain psychopathic traits don't just fail to prevent success. In specific environments, they can actively predict it. This is deeply counterintuitive because we tend to assume that lacking empathy would obviously make someone worse at working with people. But fearlessness under pressure, indifference to others' judgment, and comfort with high-stakes risk can look, from the outside, exactly like exceptional leadership. The trait isn't hiding despite success. In certain rooms, it's specifically what's producing the success.
So here's the practical question this video actually exists to answer. If someone in your life fits this pattern, what do you actually do? The first step researchers consistently recommend isn't confrontation, it's documentation, in your own mind, and if useful, on paper. Not one incident, but the pattern across time. Does this person's warmth only appear when they need something from you? Does their concern for your problems only last as long as you're useful to them? Does the story of what happened always somehow make them the reasonable one, no matter who else was involved? The second step is trusting the accumulated discomfort your gut has already been registering, even when you couldn't name why. Repeatedly feeling subtly used or strangely hollow after time with someone who seems on paper delightful is data. It's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition running quietly in the background, often faster and more accurately than your conscious mind is willing to admit. And the third, according to researchers who study this specifically, is protecting your own boundaries without needing the other person to acknowledge what's happening. People with these traits are frequently genuinely unable to recognize the harm they cause, not because they're hiding it from you, but because the entire wiring for registering that harm may simply not be fully online. Waiting for insight or remorse that may never arrive isn't a strategy.
Here's the uncomfortable truth worth sitting with as we close this out. The person this video describes is probably not a stranger and definitely not a movie villain. Statistically, they're someone you already know, someone charming, someone successful, someone who's very good at seeming exactly like everyone else, right up until you look closely enough across enough time to see the pattern underneath the performance. That doesn't mean you should audit every confident, charismatic person in your life. Most charm is exactly what it appears to be. But now you know what the four traits actually look like when they're not isolated incidents. And you know that the difference between concerning and harmless was never about any single moment. It was always about the pattern.
If this changed how you think about someone in your own life, hit like and subscribe. Every week, we dig into the psychology behind the people and patterns nobody explains clearly. And I want to know, has this ever happened to you, that slow realization that someone's warmth never quite added up to anything real? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. See you in the next one.